The quantum sensors aboard the eternal vessel Infinite Reflection registered the first human transmission on what their chronologists would later determine was a perfectly average Tuesday. High Observer Theron stood motionless at his post, his crystalline eyes fixed on the wavering signal pattern for what would have been, by human standards, an unnecessarily long time. But Theron, like all of his kind, believed in thorough observation. The signal was chaotic, disorganized, and blazingly strong. It carried what appeared to be entertainment broadcasts, military communications, and scientific data, all jumbled together in a cacophony that made Theron's eternal mind recoil. In his 6,000 years of monitoring the cosmos, he had never encountered anything quite like it. Most irregular, he finally announced to his crew, each word measured and precise. Begin standard first contact protocols. The crew, all of them having served together for at least a millennium, began their careful preparations. By human standards, their response would have seemed glacial. By eternal standards, they were rushing dangerously. It took them 3 months just to decode the basic structure of human languages. Another 6 to understand their calendar systems. The Eternals were shocked to discover that humans measured their lives not in millennia, but in mere decades. Impossible, declared Senior Analyst Fora, her silver hair shimmering as she double-checked the calculations for the 100th time. No species could achieve spaceflight in such a brief span. The mathematics alone would take centuries to develop. But the evidence was undeniable. The humans had gone from primitive chemical rockets to faster-than-light travel in less than 300 years. The Eternals had taken 12,000 years to achieve the same feat, believing that proper scientific development required careful consideration over centuries. When the Infinite Reflection finally made visual contact with a human vessel, the crew was unprepared for what they saw. The ship was small, almost cramped by eternal standards, its design emphasizing function over the aesthetic perfection that the Eternals prized. It moved with what seemed like reckless speed, making course corrections that would have required weeks of calculations among the Eternals in mere seconds. "This is the Earth ship Curiosity," came the transmission, the words arriving faster than the Eternals were comfortable processing. "We come in peace and friendship." High Observer Theron took 2 full days to compose his response, an unprecedented haste that would be noted in his permanent record. "We are the Eternal Ones. Your transmission rate exceeds our comfortable processing speed. Please adjust to 1 word per standard minute for optimal communication." The silence that followed lasted what humans would consider an awkwardly long time, but was barely a moment to the Eternals. Finally, the human ship responded, each word now carefully spaced. "We will attempt to accommodate your communication needs." The slight variation in spacing between the words would be studied by eternal linguists for decades to come, seen as evidence of the humans' inherent irregularity. The first face-to-face meeting was arranged with what the Eternals considered reckless haste, merely 6 months of preparation. Captain Sarah Chen of the Curiosity stood before the Eternal delegation, her quick movements and rapid speech patterns both fascinating and disturbing to her hosts. "How do you manage such acceleration in your technological development?" Theron asked, having spent only 3 days formulating the question. "Our records suggest your species began with stone tools mere moments ago, by our standards." Sarah's immediate response, taking no time at all to consider her words, shocked the assembled Eternals. "We don't have the luxury of time," she said. "When you only live for 80 or 90 years, you learn to make every moment count." The concept was so foreign to the Eternals that they called for an immediate recess, meaning they would reconvene in approximately 1 month to process this information. The humans, to their credit, used this time to set up a series of cultural exchange programs, establish preliminary trade agreements, and begin learning the Eternal language. Their progress in a month exceeded what the Eternals would have expected to achieve in a decade. As Theron watched the humans work, he began to understand something that both thrilled and terrified him. The humans' brief lifespans hadn't limited them. They had been transformed by them. Every human lived with an urgency that the Eternals had never known. They made decisions quickly not because they were reckless, but because they had learned to process information and act on it with an efficiency that immortality had never required of the Eternals. In his private log, Theron recorded an observation that would later be seen as prophetic. They burn so bright, these brief ones. They must, for they have so little time to light the darkness. We have forever to consider the stars, while they must reach them now, today, in the brief moments they are given. I find myself wondering, have we Eternals been watching the cosmos for so long that we have forgotten how to truly see it? The humans, meanwhile, had already begun adapting their technology to better communicate with the Eternals, developing new translation algorithms that could bridge the vast gap between their different temporal perspectives. It was a feat that should have taken years, by Eternal standards. The humans did it in weeks. And as the infinite reflection maintained its station near the Curiosity, its crew began to notice something strange happening among their own kind. Decisions that would once have taken months were now being made in weeks. Observations that would have been contemplated for years were being acted upon in months. The humans' very presence seemed to be affecting the Eternals' perception of time itself. Some saw this as a corruption of their perfect, unchanging nature. Others, like Theron, began to wonder if perhaps they had been wrong about the nature of perfection itself. The disappearances began at the edges of human space. First, it was an automated research station in the Ta Ceti system. Then, a mining outpost near Proxima Centauri went dark. The Eternal One's long-range sensors detected the disturbances, but their response followed their usual measured pace. Junior observer Lyra, barely 2,000 years old and considered almost recklessly young by her people, watched the pattern emerge with growing concern. She had spent the last 50 years studying human response patterns, a remarkably short research period by Eternal standards, and something about these disappearances felt wrong. The Council of Eternal Observation had already begun their standard analysis process. They would spend at least a decade studying the sensor data, another 5 years formulating possible hypotheses, and perhaps another century before considering any action. It was their way. Careful, methodical, perfect. But Lyra had learned something from watching the humans. Sometimes, waiting for perfection meant missing the chance to prevent disaster. She found herself standing before High Observer Theron's meditation chamber, her crystalline hand hovering over the notification panel. To disturb a superior's contemplation was almost unheard of. She would need at least a month to properly compose her thoughts and prepare her presentation. But the humans had taught her that sometimes urgency outweighed protocol. Enter. Theron's voice carried the weight of millennia, but also something new. A hint of the quick decisiveness he had begun to learn from their human allies. High Observer. Lyra spoke without taking the customary hour to gather her thoughts. I believe we face an imminent threat. The pattern of disappearances. It matches historical records from the Great Darkness. Theron's crystalline eyes widened slightly, an expression of extreme shock by Eternal standards. The Great Darkness was a period in their history from over 50,000 years ago, when something had emerged from the spaces between galaxies, consuming entire solar systems before disappearing again. The Voidborn, he whispered, the ancient name carrying echoes of terror that even immortality had not erased. But they have been gone for millennia. The humans are expanding into the same regions where we first encountered them. Lyra continued, her words coming faster now, influenced by her studies of human communication. Their colonies, their outposts, they're all in systems that the historical records mark as initial contact points with the Voidborn. Theron accessed the historical archives through his neural interface. By Eternal standards, he reviewed them with shocking speed, taking only a week instead of the customary decade. The patterns match, he confirmed, but the Council will need time to verify, to consider, to plan. The humans don't have that time. Lyra interrupted, committing what would normally be a serious breach of protocol. Their colonies are disappearing now. By the time we finish our standard analysis, their entire expansion zone could be lost. In the nearby space, the human vessel Curiosity maintained its position. Captain Chen and her crew had been busy establishing communication protocols with various Eternal research teams. They had accomplished in months what the Eternals would have expected to take centuries. Theron made a decision then that would be debated in Eternal circles for millennia to come. He bypassed the Council's normal procedures and opened a direct channel to the Curiosity. Captain Chen. He spoke rapidly by Eternal standards, though to human ears his words still came with glacial slowness. We have identified a potential threat to your expansion colonies. I am transmitting historical records that may be relevant to your current situation. The humans' response was, as always, almost instantaneous. Within hours, they had processed the vast historical archives that the Eternals had spent millennia compiling. Within days, they had developed preliminary defense strategies. Within weeks, they had begun adapting their technology to detect the unique energy signatures of the Voidborn. The speed of their adaptation is unprecedented, Lyra observed, watching the humans work. They achieve in days what took our ancestors centuries. Perhaps, Theron replied, taking only an hour to consider his words. That is precisely why they might succeed where we failed. The Voidborn defeated us because we took too long to respond, too long to adapt. We had the luxury of time, and it became our weakness. As if to prove his point, another human colony went dark. But this time, their new detection systems captured something. A glimpse of what lurked in the void between stars. The images would have taken the Eternals years to analyze properly. The humans did it in days. They're not just consuming systems, Captain Chen reported, her voice tight with controlled urgency. They're using them as breeding grounds. Each colony they take becomes a new hive. The longer we wait, the stronger they become. The Eternal Council had barely begun their preliminary discussions about whether to form a committee to study the possibility of a response when the humans presented their first battle plan. It was rushed by Eternal standards, imperfect, lacking the careful consideration that Immortals preferred. But as Lyra studied it, she realized something that her people had forgotten over their long lives. Sometimes, an imperfect action taken quickly was better than a perfect action taken too late. The humans were already mobilizing their fleets, adapting their weapons, preparing their defenses. They moved with a speed that seemed impossible to the Eternals, driven by the urgency of their limited lifespans and their determination to protect their people. And as Lyra watched them work, she began to understand why the Voidborn had never returned to challenge the Eternals after their first encounter. It wasn't because they feared the Eternals' power. It was because the Eternals had become predictable, unchanging, taking centuries to adapt to new threats. But humanity was anything but predictable. They changed, adapted, evolved at a pace that must seem terrifying to entities used to the slow, unchanging patterns of immortal species. For the first time in her 2,000 years, Lyra felt something new. The exhilarating rush of urgency, the need to act quickly, decisively. She realized that her people had been wrong. Immortality wasn't just about having endless time. It was about how you chose to use that time. And as the darkness between the stars began to stir with ancient hungers, Lyra knew that the Eternals would have to learn from humanity's example, or watch as their brilliant allies faced the darkness alone. The command center aboard the human flagship Defiance hummed with activity. Holographic displays showed the spreading darkness as the Voidborn consumed one system after another. Captain Chen had converted half the ship's cargo bay into a joint human Eternal research facility, much to the discomfort of her Eternal guests. Lyra stood at her research station, trying to match the frenetic pace of her human counterparts. Her crystalline fingers moved across the controls with what she now recognized as unnecessary deliberation. Nearby, Dr. Marcus Rivera, the human xenobiologist, was simultaneously analyzing tissue samples from a Voidborn drone, coordinating with 3 different research teams, and drinking his 4th cup of coffee. "How can you process information so quickly?" Lyra asked, having spent only 10 minutes composing the question. practically impulsive by eternal standards. Marcus glanced up from his work, his eyes bright with caffeine and excitement. "We multitask," he explained, not pausing in his analysis. "When you only have a few decades to learn everything you can about the universe, you learn to do multiple things at once." The concept was almost physically painful to Lyra's eternal mind. Her people believed in doing one thing at a time, giving each task the centuries of attention it deserved. But as she watched the humans work, she began to understand the efficiency of their method. In the 3 weeks since they'd begun their joint research initiative, the humans had made more progress in understanding the Voidborn than the Eternals had in 50,000 years of careful study. Their methods were chaotic, their conclusions often preliminary, but they were getting results. "Look at this," Marcus called out, his voice carrying the edge of discovery. He'd isolated a pattern in the Voidborn's energy signature. "They're not just consuming systems, they're processing them, converting matter into something else. But the conversion isn't perfect. There's waste energy." Lyra moved to his station, taking what humans would consider an eternity to examine the data. But she saw it too. A flaw in the Voidborn's supposedly perfect consumption process. A weakness. The Eternal Council, still in the preliminary stages of forming an emergency response committee, received the news with their usual measured consideration. They would need at least a year to properly analyze the implications. But humanity didn't wait. Within days, human engineers had developed prototype weapons that could disrupt the Voidborn's energy conversion process. The designs weren't perfect. They would have horrified Eternal engineers who believed in achieving perfection before implementation. But they worked. "We can refine them later," Captain Chen explained to the assembled Eternal observers. "Right now, we need something that works, not something that's perfect." Lyra watched as the first tests were conducted. The human weapons were crude by Eternal standards, but undeniably effective. The Voidborn's perfect consumption process was vulnerable to precisely targeted energy pulses that humans, with their quick, adaptable minds, had worked out in weeks rather than centuries. But the Voidborn were learning too. Each encounter showed new adaptations, new defenses. The humans responded by continuously modifying their weapons, changing tactics, evolving their strategies as quickly as their enemy. "This is why we failed before," Lyra realized, speaking her thoughts aloud to Marcus as they worked. "We tried to develop the perfect defense, but by the time we had it ready, the Voidborn had already adapted past it. We needed to be quick, adaptable, imperfect but effective." Marcus nodded, already modifying another weapon design. "Perfect is the enemy of good enough," he said, quoting an old human saying. "Sometimes you need to act on incomplete information, take risks, learn from failures." The concept of learning from failure was another difficult one for the Eternals. With infinite time, they had always believed in getting things right the first time. But watching the humans, Lyra began to see the power in their approach. They failed fast, learned faster, and kept moving forward. In the ship's tactical center, Captain Chen was coordinating with other human vessels, deploying the new weapons in rolling waves of experiments. Some failed, some succeeded. All provided data that was immediately analyzed and used to improve the next attempt. The Eternal Council was still deliberating on whether to officially recognize the crisis when humanity launched their first major counteroffensive. It was rushed, improvised, and completely unlike anything the Voidborn had faced before. And it worked. The first battle was brief by Eternal standards, lasting only 6 hours. The humans lost 3 ships but destroyed 2 Voidborn hives. More importantly, they gathered massive amounts of data about how their enemy fought, thought, and adapted. "We'll do better next time," Captain Chen promised the Eternal observers, who were still processing the implications of the battle that had ended days ago. "Every engagement teaches us something new." Lyra, watching the humans plan their next move even as they were still analyzing the last one, finally understood what made them so formidable. It wasn't just their speed. It was their comfort with imperfection, their willingness to act on incomplete information, their ability to learn and adapt on the fly. They didn't have the luxury of waiting for perfect understanding or perfect solutions. Their limited lifespans had forced them to become masters of rapid adaptation and iterative improvement. As the Defiance prepared for its next engagement, Lyra made a decision that would have shocked her younger self. She began to move faster, to think faster, to accept imperfect solutions as stepping stones to better ones. Because she had finally understood something crucial. The Voidborn weren't just a threat to humanity or the Eternals. They were a threat to all life in the galaxy, and stopping them would require both the wisdom of immortality and the urgent adaptability of beings who knew the value of every passing moment. The void between Proxima Centauri and Alpha Centauri rippled with unnatural energies. The combined human-Eternal fleet held position, their sensors tracking the massive Voidborn hive fleet emerging from hyperspace. Captain Chen stood on the bridge of the Defiance, now reinforced with Eternal technology that had been hastily adapted to human combat tactics. "They're changing their pattern," Lyra announced, her voice carrying an urgency that would have been unthinkable for an Eternal just months ago. "The energy signatures are shifting faster than our models predicted." The Voidborn had learned from their previous encounters. Their perfect, methodical consumption of systems had given way to something quicker, more aggressive. They had adapted to match humanity's pace, making them more dangerous than ever. "They're learning from us," Marcus observed from his station, where he continued to analyze the enemy's biological readings. "Just as we're learning from them. It's an evolutionary arms race in real time." The Eternal ships in the fleet, their crystalline hulls gleaming with accumulated centuries of artistry, moved with unprecedented speed. Under human guidance, they had modified their traditional combat doctrines. Gone were the days of spending years calculating the perfect attack vector. Now they moved with what their crews considered reckless haste, though still slower than their human allies. "All ships, execute pattern Delta," Chen ordered, her voice calm despite the chaos of battle. The human vessels immediately broke formation, executing a complex series of maneuvers that would have taken an Eternal fleet weeks to choreograph. The Eternal ships followed moments later, their delayed response part of a carefully planned strategy. The Voidborn, expecting the methodical precision of Eternal warfare, found themselves caught between the swift strikes of human ships and the powerful but delayed responses of their Eternal allies. Their perfect formations began to break apart. "Energy disruption weapons, full spread," Chen commanded. The humans had refined their original prototype weapons into devastating arrays that could shatter the Voidborn's matter conversion process. Eternal ships target their cleanup efforts. The battle unfolded like a deadly dance. Human ships darted through the chaos, their weapons disrupting the Voidborn's carefully orchestrated consumption patterns. The Eternal vessels followed in their wake, their powerful weapons destroying anything that survived the initial assault. But the Voidborn were far from defeated. A massive tendril of void matter lashed out, destroying 3 human ships before they could evade. The Eternal vessel Twilight Contemplation began its standard evasive protocols, which would have taken hours to complete. "Twilight, break port now." Chen's voice cut through the command channel. To everyone's shock, the Eternal ship responded instantly, breaking its standard protocols. The void tendril missed by meters. Sometimes, the Eternal captain transmitted, taking only minutes to compose his message, "The wisdom of ages must yield to the wisdom of the moment." The battle raged for what the Eternals considered a mere instant, 14 hours by human standards. The Voidborn, for the first time in their ancient history, found themselves unable to predict their opponent's actions. The humans moved too quickly, adapted too readily, and the Eternals no longer held to their predictable patterns. "Major breach in their center mass," Marcus reported, his sensors detecting a critical weakness in the main Voidborn hive cluster. "The disruption cascade is working faster than they can adapt." Chen didn't hesitate. "All ships, concentrate fire on these coordinates. Everything you have. Now." The combined fleet struck as one, humanity's speed and the Eternal's power synchronized at last. The void itself seemed to scream as the hive cluster began to break apart. Energy readings are approaching critical levels, Lyra reported, her fingers flying across her console with very un-eternal-like speed. Their matter conversion process is breaking down completely. The Voidborn hive cluster imploded, its perfect consumption matrix shattering under the combined assault. The remaining void tendrils began to retreat, their coordinated patterns dissolving into chaos. But even in victory, the humans didn't slow down. "Track their retreat vectors," Chen ordered. "We need to know where they're running to." Pattern analysis. Now, the Eternal Council would have spent decades studying the battle before considering a pursuit. But they weren't in charge anymore. The Human Eternal Joint Command, established out of desperate necessity, was already plotting intercept courses. "We've found their primary nest," Lyra announced, her rapid analysis shocking her fellow Eternals. "It's in the dark space between the Orion and Sagittarius arms. The retreat patterns all converge there." The surviving Voidborn forces flood into the darkness, but for the first time in their ancient history, they fled in fear. They had encountered something they couldn't adapt to fast enough. The combination of humanity's swift innovation and the Eternals' profound power. As the fleet regrouped and began planning their next move, Lyra approached Captain Chen on the Defiance's observation deck. "I understand now," she said, speaking without her usual lengthy consideration, "why they never came back to challenge us after their first attack. We Eternals became predictable, unchanging. But humanity, your chaos incarnate, beautiful, brilliant chaos." Chen smiled, already reviewing reports and planning the next phase of operations. "Sometimes chaos is exactly what you need," she said, "especially when facing an enemy that thinks it has forever to perfect its plans." The Voidborn had finally encountered something they couldn't simply consume and adapt to. A species that changed faster than they could, backed by the power of beings who had perfected their abilities over eons. It was a combination that would reshape the galaxy, assuming they could finish what they had started. The hunt was on, and for the first time, time itself was on their side.